Welcome to this explainer. If you've ever heard the account of the fall of Jericho, it's usually told in a pretty simplistic way. The Israelites marched, they shouted, and boom, the walls tumbled down. It sounds a lot like a children's story, right? But here's the thing. When we actually sit down and examine the historical text alongside the engineering, the physics, and the logistics described, the sheer magnitude of this event becomes absolutely staggering. So let's dive right in and see what the source material tells us actually happened.
To systematically uncover the truth behind the rubble today, we're going to peel back 5 specific layers. First up, the anatomy of the fortress. Second, we'll look at their completely illogical siege strategy. Third, we'll test if this actually defies the laws of physics. Fourth, we'll decode the divine strategy at play. And finally, we'll pull some profound everyday lessons from the rubble. Let's get into it.
Section 1. Anatomy of the fortress. Okay, we need to establish right up front that ancient Jericho wasn't just a flimsy little wall you could tip over with a good push. Archaeology at the site actually shows us it was a massive, highly intelligent fortified system. Look, Bronze Age cities like this one, they were specifically built to endure devastating siege engines, brutal fire attacks, and incredibly prolonged starvation sieges. The point is, they were emphatically not designed to fail suddenly. They were designed to outlast the enemy no matter what.
Just picture the intimidating, multi-tiered setup attackers were actually facing here. Down at the base, you had a stone retaining wall, sometimes called a revetment wall, that was roughly 12 to 15 feet high all on its own. Then, sitting right on top of that, was a massive mud brick wall, another 6 to 8 feet thick. And behind all of that, a steeply sloped earthen rampart leading all the way up to yet another upper wall. When you combine all of this multi-layered defense system likely reached an imposing 30 to 50 plus feet in total height. It had massive lateral stability. So the Israelites weren't just staring down a wall, they were facing a tiered, seemingly impregnable fortress.
Moving on to Section 2, an illogical siege strategy.
Now, if you're facing an overwhelming structure like that, you'd expect a massive military campaign, right? But the Israelites didn't build siege ramps. They didn't roll up with battering rams. They didn't even try to starve the city out. Instead, the strategy outlined in the source text seems, well, completely illogical. For days 1 through 6, their marching orders were just to walk around the city, once a day, in complete, absolute silence with only the priests blowing trumpets. Then day 7 rolls around. Now they have to march 7 times, blow a massive trumpet blast, let out a massive shout, and just watch the fortress collapse. Logistically and militarily speaking, this makes literally zero sense.
Which brings us to Section 3, defying the laws of physics.
So could this actually work scientifically? Let's treat this like a strict physics problem for a second. Can vibrations from footsteps, acoustics from human voices, or maybe a sudden seismic event plausibly explain the sheer lateral destruction of a 50-foot, multi-tiered retaining wall system? Let's break that down. Let's hit these theories one by one. First up, rhythmic marching resonance. Even if an entire army synchronized their steps perfectly, the frequency of human footsteps is just way too low. And the mass of that earthen and stone wall, it's far too great for foot traffic to cause any sort of collapse. Okay, what about sound? Humans shouting, even an entire army screaming at the top of their lungs, reaches about 90 to 100 decibels. To put that into perspective, that's roughly the volume of a noisy lawnmower. It is nowhere near the destructive resonance required to literally shatter stone and dense mud brick. Structural damage from sound requires extremely high resonance and incredibly precise frequency matching. So the bottom line here, there is absolutely no plausible acoustic scenario where shouting drops a tiered fortress.
But wait, what about an earthquake? Now, Jericho actually does sit near a fault line, so a localized earthquake is naturally possible. However, the biblical account requires perfectly timed seismic activity. We're talking an earthquake hitting the exact second after the final shout. Furthermore, the collapse was incredibly selective. The text explicitly notes that Rahab's house, which was built right into the city wall, was completely preserved. A random, localized earthquake simply doesn't selectively preserve a single structure while perfectly timing the utter annihilation of the rest of the perimeter. This detail alone pushes the event far beyond a simple, natural explanation.
All right, let's look at Section 4, decoding the divine strategy.
If physics can't explain this, we have to look deeper. We need to decode the precise theological orchestration and the incredible symbolism hiding right in plain sight in the source text. Think about those 6 days of silence. The people were commanded not to utter a single battle cry. Why? Well, it wasn't just them being inactive. It actually represented a profound restraint of the flesh. It perfectly mirrors Psalm 46:10. Be still and know that I am God.
Walking around that wall in total silence meant they were trusting the process without seeing any visible progress. It was an exercise in contained faith, teaching them obedience without giving them an immediate explanation.
And what about those trumpets? They actually weren't your typical metallic war horns. They were shofars. These were priestly ram's horns historically used for worship and to announce the presence of God. When you combine that with the Ark of the Covenant being positioned right in the dead center of the marching formation, it becomes really clear. The source text frames this not as a military battle, but as a sacred procession. God wasn't just helping them out in a fight. The text shows he was literally leading it.
Now let's look at the numerology, because numbers in ancient texts carry massive, massive weight. 6 days represent human effort and incompletion. But the 7th day, that represents divine completion. It's a pattern that traces all the way back to the creation week. So marching for 6 days showcased human limitation. We can only do so much. But on the 7th day, they didn't just march once, they marched 7 times. That is completion intensified. It's this beautiful theological message of divine fulfillment stepping in precisely at the moment where human ability completely runs out.
And when that divine fulfillment finally stepped in, the result was surprisingly specific. The original Hebrew wording used to describe the collapse doesn't actually mean the walls just crumbled randomly into dust. A better translation is that the wall fell beneath itself, essentially collapsing straight downward. Now, why does that matter? Because it created something highly strategic.
Believe it or not, archaeological remains of the retaining wall actually support this ramp-like pile concept. By collapsing straight downward, those massive mud brick upper walls essentially created a literal ramp right over the massive stone foundation. This allowed the Israelites to just charge straight up and into the city. It wasn't mindless, chaotic destruction. It was a strategically engineered collapse that turned an unscalable barrier into a direct pathway for victory.
Let's wrap things up with Section 5. Lessons from the rubble.
So what can we actually take away from the rubble of Jericho? The text offers us 5 huge lessons. First, delay is often intentional faith conditioning. Those 6 days where absolutely nothing happened, they were absolutely crucial. Second, true obedience can look totally illogical to the outside world. Third, victory is given before it is seen. The text actually says Joshua was told, "I have given you the city," past tense, before a single person took a single step. Fourth, breakthrough often follows repetition. The wall didn't fall on day 1 or day 6, it was day 7, lap 7. And finally, weak means are intentionally used, like literally just walking and shouting, to overthrow strongholds. This ensures that no human army could ever look back and boast, "Hey, we did this by our own strength."
You see, Jericho wasn't just a city. It represented the very first massive barrier in the Promised Land. And looking at these imposing barriers reminds us of our own personal strongholds. The source material strongly suggests that the impossible obstructions in our lives don't fall to brute force. Instead, they fall to consistency, obedience, and faith that is released at the absolute perfect moment.
Which brings us to a final, slightly provocative thought I want to leave you with today. If this had just been a random, natural collapse, well, it'd just be an interesting historical footnote. But because it required impossible mechanics, highly specific symbolic precision, and perfect down-to-the-second timing, we really have to ask ourselves, is God just stronger than the obstacles in front of you, or does he actually orchestrate and control the exact moment they fall? Think about that for a bit. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I really hope this completely changes how you view the fall of Jericho.